Hello, everyone. Welcome to this series, Understanding People, brought to you by getAbstract. My name is Kirsten Müller-Daubermann, and I'm going to be your host throughout this series. So what we wanted to do is examine interpersonal communication, why we understand or misunderstand each other, and how to build bridges, even when things like biology, context, and personal biases are working against us. Every episode, we're going to be talking with authors and experts in an effort to break down specific barriers that stand in the way of us understanding others so that we can communicate more effectively and improve our work, our family, and our social relationships. But before we get into understanding people, I wanted to start with understanding ourselves. How do we tick? And I think none of us has scrolled through our LinkedIn feed without seeing another link to a personality test, your Enneagram. People are really, really interested in self-examination. Why do I do the things that I do? How can I understand myself better so that I can actually change? And this is something that's not just good for your work life, but it's also great for your personal life. And we wanted to invite the expert to come on for our very first episode to help us figure out what our essence is, what our core ideology is, what makes us tick, what our style is. And the really cool thing is that he does it all with an analogy to winemaking. So our guest for today's episode is international speaker, author, and founder of theleadershipdifference.com, Dave Mitchell. Dave, welcome to the show.
Oh, pleasure to be here, Kirsten. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So you have this great book. It's actually summarized in the getAbstract library. It's called The Power of Understanding Yourself. So why did you write this book?
It's actually kind of a funny story. My most popular program, I started my company 25 years ago, and one of the programs I developed is called The Power of Understanding People. And the genesis for that program was just basically to help people do exactly what you're talking about, better appreciate our differences, how those differences can both be quite valuable to us and also quite irritating to us. And I wanted to do it on a platform that had a lot of levity and fun. So I compared the different ways of communicating to iconic Hollywood movie characters. And the popularity of that program resulted in me landing the book deal with Wiley. And so as I continued to deliver this program, the thing that I started to notice was after I would get done, people would take their assessment, the assessment that you did, and they would kind of thrust it in my face at the book signing and say, "What does this mean about me, Dave? What does this mean about me?" And I started to realize how I wouldn't say how little we're interested in other people, but how much we really want to know more about ourselves. And so I kind of felt compelled to write a follow-up book, and I had to switch the analogy from Hollywood movie characters to wine, because I think the process of winemaking is largely about extracting from the grape, the highest quality of juice so that you can make the best wine. And that process, I think, is very analogous for self-discovery, right? I got to try to figure out what my best qualities are and how to put those into the world. So that's how The Power of Understanding Yourself was created.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it is this in an effort to understand others better. We can't do that if we don't do self-reflection and self-discovery, if we don't start there. But you talk
Absolutely.
A lot in your book about the idea of metacognition. It's a big word. What exactly do you mean by that, and how is it beneficial?
So I refer to myself as I learn through epiphanies. It's funny when I get excited about something and I share it, like with my lovely bride. She says, "Well, how did you not already know that?" And I would say, "Well, I did know it, but I didn't get it." Right. And so one of my frustrations, I was a human resources executive here in the States, was how many times I was around relatively successful leaders at very high levels in the organization who would display self-awareness and be very proud of, I'm very self-aware. And these qualities they were self-aware of were actually toxic. But somehow them saying, "Well, I'm aware of that about myself," seemed to forgive them of the impact of these characteristics. And so I started to realize it's not enough to just be self-aware. You have to kind of understand why you do that, what impact that has on other people, and if it's not beneficial, how do I change that? So metacognition is like a next level of self-awareness, where you're not only aware of how you behave, but you start to trace it back to the origins of that behavior, and then take the steps necessary to correct it if it's a behavior that's not conducive to better performance, better relationships, a better quality of life for you.
Do you think that maybe the reason people avoid metacognition is because they're afraid of what they'll find?
I suppose that's true. I think probably more likely is we just never take the time to really evaluate these things. I mean, there's plenty of distractions in life, and we can spend large chunks of time just going through our routines and addressing the things that come up. And then when we do have evidence that we have behaviors that are not particularly useful or could be destructive to in some ways, we can pass it off as, that's just me. I always do that. Metacognition is not necessarily easy. And even if you were to engage in it, trying to figure out what to do with it after you've had some of these realizations is even harder. I mean, people go to therapists for years to try to fix, just one or two aspects of their behavior. So I think a lot of it is I don't really know how to do it. And second, I'm not carving out any time to do it because life is pretty full as it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can hear some objections because I've worked in the field of mental health as an advocate and working with nonprofits. And so I've always been a big advocate of therapy and also that it is not just what some people there's a lot of stigma about self-reflection and about self-discovery, and that all of this can be categorized as navel gazing. Right? Our society we're so obsessed with ourselves now rather than looking outward and being open and we're so consumed with ourselves. Is this navel gazing? Can all of this self-discovery and personality tests go too far? Or what's your view of that?
Well, I think anything can go too far, right? I don't know that anything taken to an extreme can eventually have debilitating or negative consequences. But I would address that objection by saying that we are self-centered, and that's not an indictment of humanity. It's a comment on the engineering of our being, right? Our brain, which processes all the data that we're receiving about reality, is in the middle of our sensory receptors. So we, by nature, compare everything that we experience to how we perceive things should be and how things are and how I would do it in that situation. So I think if we're going to improve our ability with these relationships outside of ourselves, we first have to kind of understand where we're coming from. So yes, I think it's certainly possible that you can go inside your head too far and become just consumed by yourself. I mean, I think that tips into mental health issues. I think a healthy individual who is looking to increase the success of their relationships and their own abilities and their ability to contribute to this world has a keen understanding of who they are, strengths, weaknesses, gifts, foibles. It's important to know that about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we dive into the 4 different interactive styles that you have this great assessment in your book, The Power of Understanding Yourself, where one can answer some questions and then they get the results and it puts them into one of 4 interactive styles, which I will let you explain. But before we get there, you also talk about discovering what your core ideology is, or what your values are. And that seems really simple, but it's actually not. And in fact, if you ask people what their values are, sometimes they'll say, well, honesty or integrity. Well, Yeah, duh. It's not that, a value of yours is going to be lying, stealing, cheating, and killing people. Those aren't what most people would say are values. What questions can someone start asking themselves to figure out what their core ideology is and what their values really are? Because the way that we get tripped up and disordered is when we don't act in alignment of our values. But we have to start with knowing what they are. Where do we start?
Yeah. No, and that's a great question. And I'll be honest with you. You are absolutely right. Understanding your core ideology is, for me at least, far more challenging than taking an assessment tool and figuring out this is how I prefer to communicate. And so when I set about doing that, most of my work is done with organizations and corporations. So I'm more organizational psychology than I am behavioral psychology or cognitive psychology. So, I had a methodology for helping organizations understand their core ideology, and I kind of tried to transfer that same approach to people. And those that have worked with me know one of my heretic moments on stage is my condemnation of corporate values. I just think that that's the stupidest thing in the world. The poster on the break room wall, and like you said, the first one up there is honesty, and I'm like, how long did that take to arrive at? Were we bouncing that around? Should we be honest? What do you think, guys? Let's take a vote. What, 4-3? Honesty's on the wall. It just drives me crazy. So I wanted to try to figure out what really are guiding values for organizations. And so I had arrived at a list, and then I took that list, but when I started thinking about, okay, how does this apply to individuals? I just added a few that were more specific to an individual human being than would be a collective. And some of them on my list, and I say in the book, this is not a definitive list. Go invent your own if you think there's something that you value that's not included here. But I put things like fame and wealth, and people have said to me, well, I don't really see that as a value. And I said, well, I'm being very literal about value. I'm talking about, what do you value? Because this is what's going to guide your decisions. This is what's going to guide your feeling of purpose. And if you're going to sit in front of me and tell me that there are people that don't put a high value on fame, I will direct you to Twitter immediately so that you can monitor that timeline for a little bit. I mean, clearly there are things like fame, there's things like wealth, there's things like religion that don't generally, if you put a list of values like you'd see in a corporate setting, these wouldn't be on that list, but these are things that drive people's behavior. So all I really challenge people to do is take this list, and I'm a big sports fan, Kirsten, so as silly as this sounds, I approached it like it was the NCAA tournament here in the United States, and I started playing the values against each other to see who survived and continued. And if you can get that list, if you can get it down to like a final 10, then you've made some really tough decisions. And then in the book, I'm really evil because I said, now take it down to 5. And as I shared with you when we talked on the phone, like social justice was on my top 10, but it didn't make my top 5. And I remember like sitting at my desk, thinking, do I want to admit that? Do I want to admit that, social justice isn't as important to me as financial security? But the fact of the matter is, if I'm in a decision situation where the stability of my family's finances and social justice is the choice, I'm probably going to choose financial stability. And I'm not proud of that. But that's part of the process, is figuring yourself out and saying, okay, well, what are your choices and who are you? Because this is going to shape this personal mission statement that represents your core ideology.
Absolutely. So let's walk through the 4 interactive styles. What are they? And give us just a brief description of each.
Yeah, so I could just go on forever, and your producer would cut us off and say, that was a great first try. Let's do this again. But basically, in all these Jungian psychology assessment tools like Myers-Briggs type indicator, like DISC profiles, like predictive index, and true colors. They all kind of have 4 iconic, observable communication styles, interactive styles. So I just developed my own assessment and my own methodology kind of around those same 4. So I have one that is more emotionally sensitive, and that one we call the romantic. And would you like for me to describe each of these as I introduce them? Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please.
So romantics, just, to give you a sense of what these look like as you interact with other people, and it could be you as well. It's certainly you, Kirsten. It's actually me as well. These people tend to be very tactful, very diplomatic, because if you can imagine, they're sensitive to emotions. So most of the way they communicate is designed to manage the emotional reaction. So I don't want people to get angry. I don't want people to be sad. I don't want people to be hurt by anything that I say. I mean, unless that's their intent, but that's pretty rare. Generally, they're just trying to do no harm emotionally, and if anything, maybe push the emotional state up a bit. So they are very good packagers. I always say, if you ever get fired from a job, you'll want to be fired by a romantic. You'll cry, they'll cry. It'll be 3 days before you know you lost your job, basically, because there's going to be a hug involved. It's going to be nice. So
we're social
now, yeah, it's a virtual hug right now. So a lot of people think that these are like opposites on these y-x axes. It's not like that. It's often depicted that way, and that's a bad depiction. But there is very different ones. And so romantics have some natural friction very often with the style I call warrior. And warriors are very logical in the way that they think. And so when they communicate, for them, it's about just getting to the point, getting this, whatever this interaction is designed to achieve, let's get to that achievement fast. So they can be much more brusque, very direct, not as likely to engage in the packaging of a romantic by, pleasantries and how was your weekend and all this other stuff that is, in the mind of a warrior, completely unnecessary. So 2 very different styles. Now, I happen to be a romantic warrior, so I have some of this inherent conflict that resides inside my head. So that's a whole nother matter, and we could spend a lot of time just on that. Then the third one is what I call the expert style. This is a much more sensory-oriented style, very pragmatic, very much prove it to me. I trust what I know to be true based on what I've personally experienced. I don't like to make like vocational stereotypes, but in my mind, I think of an engineer or someone who's very step-by-step flow chart, best practices, total quality management oriented. So they tend to be very thorough. They tend to be precise. They're risk avoidant. They may be a bit stubborn when it comes to change because they fear that the change will introduce chaos, and chaos is the sworn enemy of the expert. And then finally, our fourth one is the mastermind. This is the more conceptual, the more flexible, risk tolerant, likes options, gets bored easily. Sometimes masterminds, if their preference is so well defined, they can almost start to display characteristics that we might refer to as like ADD, as flighty, as lacking focus. But really, it's because they have all these things going on in their head, and so if anything gets boring, they just bounce to something new. So there you are. So it's romantic, warrior, expert, and mastermind.
Very cool. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. And what's really cool is in your book, you have the assessment. I took it and you sent me back my results. And I was not surprised, nor was my husband. So I am strongly the romantic style. And what's cool about what you do with the assessment as well is that you identify, as you did with you said your secondary influence is the warrior. Mine is the mastermind. And that leads to, back to the wine analogy, this idea of punching down. So, punching down the corks so that, we have more depth of flavor in the wine. So a romantic mixed with a mastermind is called the love interest. So we don't have time to go through all this, like all of the pairing of the primary and the secondary influences. But why don't you just share a little bit about how those two interact and how the styles interact with each other?
Yeah, this was because I talk about interactive styles in both books, The Power of Understanding People and The Power of Understanding Yourself. The difference is in the first book, it was directed at other people in your life and how to be more effective in leadership or sales or service or marriages or resolving conflicts. So in this book, shameless plug, in this book, I encourage you to punch down, which in wine language is when they push the must down into the juice to impart some more complexity and some more nuance. So I'm encouraging people then to take a look at your scores and really figure out what this means beyond just, I'm a romantic and a secondary mastermind in your case. So, for example, you have very well-defined preferences and lack of preferences. So in fact, you have what I refer to as a dynamic pattern. So, and I know this gets confusing for people who are trying to follow this without any of this in front of them, but there's kind of two considerations. There is what's my preference? What's my secondary preference? Because those are the two that typically form the way you interact. But another consideration is, how does that pattern look in terms of distribution? Because if all the numbers are very close, then that tells me that you have some influence from all the interactive styles. But if it's very broad, it makes your personality more defined, more obvious to other people. So you're an easier person for other people to read. So for you specifically, because your romantic is such a distinct preference, and then the mastermind is singular in its secondary influence, you are like a poster child for the love interest. So people who like that style will like you immediately. I mean, immediately, because this is who Kirsten is. She doesn't really adjust much contextually. She is what she is. People that don't like that style will dislike you immediately and self-select out of your life with your full support, I'm sure. So, and I have a particular fondness for love interests. My lovely bride of 35 years is a love interest. Many of my friends are love interests. So clearly this is a style that I'm very comfortable with. My style is different in that I have a romantic and a warrior duality of preference. So my preference for both of those is exactly the same. So that's called a crusader. So I fight for causes. So now you start to see why taking social justice off my list was hard, because this is who I am. I identify what I believe is the right thing to do, and then I fight for that at great personal peril sometimes because I believe it's the right thing to do. So I'm going to be a little edgier than you over an extended period of time, and people might be confused by why sometimes I seem really, tactful, diplomatic, and fun, and other times I get this intensity in my eyes, and they can tell, oh man, he's not happy, so punching down is the process of looking at these. The other thing, and I don't want to dominate the time, is look at the ones that aren't near the top. Like we share that for both of us. We don't actually share that exactly, but like for both of us, experts will be a little difficult for us, and also very useful to us because experts. By the way, like for this show, experts would have had me rehearse this 2 or 3 times. We'd have done a couple of trial runs and gotten prepared for this because they don't like anything to any surprises, right? Well, that would have been irritating to me because for me as a warrior, I just said, what's the point of all this? So we make a few mistakes. It's not that big a deal. We're not going live on network television for 100 million people to see. Let's keep it in perspective.
Thank God.
For you warriors, so when I get when I get into my edgy mode, that's where you would probably go, oh crap, I thought he was a nice guy, but that seemed very forceful. Because this is, I think, if I recall, your least favorite style, your least sensitivity. So you'll have the most difficulty understanding why someone would behave that way. And what's interesting to me is I want to see what your spouse's style is, because my experience has been romantics and warriors dig each other like a ditch when it comes to romance. So they end up, many marriages are composed of these two styles, which is a really interesting dynamic.
I think, I'm just guessing, I think he's a warrior style with like a romantic secondary influence. That's my guess. Because we're very
that's
similar
James
in a lot of ways.
Bond, by the way.
That's James Bond?
Yes.
Yes. I lucked out. Okay. Then we'll just leave that there. But see, I think what going through this assessment has really proven and shown is that the interest that we have in understanding ourselves automatically leads to, okay, that's why that person is the way that they are. They're that style. Okay, now I understand why I don't click necessarily with these people. And so that helps me in my relationships. So it all starts with understanding yourself better so that we can understand others. So Dave.
Yeah, I mean, not to just to jump on that, stress, people like to blame other things for their stress, but stress is all here, right? But the stress is created here. The world is just happening. It's how we perceive the world that leads to our stress. So that's why it's so important to understand yourself, because if you're telling me you're stressed out, that's because of things that are going on in your head, not because of things that are going on out here.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, we could talk for ages about this, and the topic is so fascinating. And I'll let you at the end let people know where they can get the assessment themselves and buy your book. But I want to end with this concept of, okay, so with my learning French in high school, vers raison, but you say it the way you say it. It's kind of a last concept in winemaking that applies to this idea of trying to understand yourself.
Yeah, so varaison is that kind of mysterious moment in the vineyard where all the grapes, which have been green up till now, start to turn purple if they're going to produce a red wine. So nobody really, I think, so maybe one of your viewers will correct me, but I don't know that we know exactly the origin of this moment, why the grapes make that turn. But until they make that turn, they're incapable of making fine wine. So the analogy there for me was that a lot of the way we think is almost all the way we think is developed when we're young, right? We get to the age of 22 to 26, and most of our cognitive schemas that we'll use the rest of our life to make sense out of the world are already installed. But if you think about how your life changes, when you hit 30, when you hit 40, when you hit 50, the thought that you're using the same cognitive schema that you installed at the age of 15 doesn't really make any sense. So for us to really extract the greatest qualities about ourselves and use those and put our best effort into the world, I think we have to have that mysterious moment of varaison to think about, well, what do I need to change about myself? Why do I behave this way? What experiences have I had that led me to think this way? And is that useful to me now that I'm 40 as it was when I was, 18? So, and this, as you start thinking this way, you start, I travel, or I did before the pandemic, I traveled 250 days a year. And airports are a wonderful petri dish for observing human behavior. And I would see people behave in ways, and I could see this is how you behave since you were 12, and it's just not very effective when you're 50. So that's an example of that's a person who stayed green. They never went through version. That's what I'm trying to compel people in the book to examine is, it's not enough, like you said, it's not enough just to gaze at your navel. We also want to make sure that it's the navel we want, and if not, how do we get that navel? That metaphor seemed better when I started it than it ended up being, but you know what I mean.
All good. No, it's so important. And the maturation is up to us. Once we do this self-examination, figure out what our stressors are, what schema or values that we have, whether that needs updating, upgrading, and really turning self-reflection into actual change.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So Dave, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And please let people know, I'm sure you sparked their interest. Where can they find your book and the assessment and everything that you do?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is The Power of Understanding Yourself. I got to get that. I go in the wrong direction here. There we go. Get it on the screen. Yeah. All right. It's available at all bookstores. Anywhere that you buy your books, you can get it. It was released last year, so it's still a very recent book. Can I just real quickly, one of the things I'm most proud about the book, and I really appreciate getAbstract making an editor's pick. That was very nice. But I fought really hard to get the assessment in the book and put the scoring key in the book. Typically when people have assessments, they monetize them. They charge people to go take the assessment online. That would be the best approach from a commerce standpoint. But remember, my core ideology is not immense wealth. It's just stability. So I wanted that in the book. So I think one of the things I'm most proud of is you buy the book, you get the assessments, you get how to score them, you can use them. There's no hidden cost or any craziness like that. It's meant, as I tell people, I want you to be impacted in a good way. That's my personal mission statement, to positively affect the life of each person I come in contact with.
Well, you certainly made a positive impact on me and on everyone I know who's going to be watching this. So thank you so much.
Send me your husband's assessment.
I will, for sure. So thank all of you so much for watching. It was so great to have you here. I hope that you enjoyed this first episode in our series, Understanding People, starting, of course, with understanding yourself better. If this was helpful to you and you want to share it, of course, feel free across your social media pages. There's a share link. You can do that. And stay tuned, because in just a couple of weeks, we're going to have episode 2. And now we're going to be diving into how do other people tick? How do we relate to them? How do we improve our interpersonal communication? And going through some interesting debates. The first one, intuition versus reason. How do people make decisions? So stay tuned for that. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world watching this, and we'll see you next time. Bye.